The map doesn't lie, that's what we're taught anyway. That a map is just geography, just fact, just lines and names laid down by people who measured things carefully and wrote down what they found. But maps are made by someone, and someone, somewhere, gets to decide what's worth marking down and what gets left blank. Look closely enough at the map of Australia and you'll start to notice the gaps, not the obvious ones. Not the deserts or the salt flats everyone already knows are empty. The other gaps, the quiet ones, places where roads end without explanation. Places where the satellite image shows the unmistakable grid of old streets, old foundations, and old town, and yet the map says nothing. No name, no marker, no history. Once these were communities, schools, churches, hundreds of families, sometimes more. Now they're coordinates with nothing attached to them. This isn't an accident of cartography. It's not that nobody got around to updating the records. Across this country, there's a pattern, repeated again and again, in different states, under different governments for almost a century, of communities, missions and reserves built around Aboriginal Australians and then deliberately, administratively erased. Not just abandoned, erased. What you're about to see is 13 of those places. 13 locations that once held lives, and don't anymore, not on paper, not in most history books, and in some cases not even in living memory much longer. We start with the ones that look, on the surface, like simple decline, and by the end we'll be somewhere much darker, somewhere that doesn't even have a name anymore. In the early 1960s, a mission station tucked into dense bushland was home to several hundred people. There were dormitories, a chapel, a small school building with hand-painted signs above the blackboard. Government inspectors visited periodically, filed their reports, moved on. Then, almost without warning, a decree came down. The mission would close. Residents were to be relocated, some to towns, some to other reserves, scattered in a way that made it almost impossible for extended families to stay together. Within a few years, the buildings were gone too. Timber was salvageable, so it was taken. What couldn't be moved was left to the climate. Today, if you walk that patch of bush, and very few people do, you'll find concrete foundations swallowed by undergrowth. The outline of a building here, a doorstep leading to nothing. Termite mounds taller than the walls that used to stand beside them. There's no plaque, no turn-off from the main road suggesting anything is there at all. Just slabs of concrete, slowly being pulled apart by root systems, in a forest that has had 60 years to take back what was, for a while, somebody's home. This one starts differently, with a court case, not a closure notice. For generations, Aboriginal stockmen and station workers had been the backbone of the pastoral industry across huge parts of the country. They mustered cattle, broke in horses, worked stock camps for weeks at a time, and were paid in rations. Flour, tea, tobacco, sometimes a small wage, held in trust accounts they rarely saw the contents of. Then came a landmark equal wages ruling. On paper, it was a victory, decades overdue, a basic acknowledgement that work deserved payment. In practice, for many communities, it triggered something else entirely. Station owners, suddenly required to pay award wages, simply stopped employing Aboriginal workers in the numbers they had before. Families who had lived on these properties for generations, sometimes longer than the current owners' families had, were told to leave. The communities that had grown up around these stations, informal but stable, with their own social structures, simply had nowhere left to be. People drifted to fringe camps on the edges of towns, to reserves, to wherever there was space. The houses they'd built, modest but homes, were left standing for a while. Then they weren't. A change in the law, meant to correct one injustice, became the mechanism for another kind of displacement. Nobody planned it that way exactly, but nobody stopped it either. On the coast, there's a stretch of land that was once a thriving fishing settlement. Aboriginal families who'd worked the waters there for longer than anyone could properly date, mixed in with later arrivals drawn by the same abundance of fish and shellfish. In the 1970s, word came through that the area had been earmarked for a mining project. Mineral sands, the kind used in industrial processes most residents had never heard of. Surveys were conducted, leases were granted, and the community was told, politely but firmly, that they'd need to relocate. So they did. Houses were dismantled or left behind. Families moved inland to towns that had nothing to do with the sea, to lives that looked nothing like the ones they'd had. And then, the mine never opened. Approvals stalled, markets shifted, The project that had displaced an entire coastal community quietly died on someone's desk, unannounced, unmourned, while the people who'd been moved out of its way stayed moved. Today, the coastline there is empty. Beautiful, in the way that empty coastlines often are. Tracks lead down to the water, tracks that were once footpaths between houses. If you didn't know, you'd think it had always been wilderness. It hadn't. Inland, on what's now private grazing land, there's a small fenced area that the property owners maintain, almost as an afterthought, almost out of obligation rather than ceremony. Inside the fence, a cemetery. Maybe 30 graves, some marked with timber crosses long since fallen, a couple with engraved headstones, most with nothing at all, just slight depressions in the earth that locals who know the history can point out, a short distance away, hidden in long grass, the foundations of what used to be a school. You can trace the rooms if you look. A rectangle here, a smaller rectangle that might have been an office or a store. This was once a government reserve. Hundreds of people lived here at its peak. There was a ration depot, a school, a small clinic that visited periodically. Then, in the 1950s, the reserve was revoked. The land was returned to pastoral lease, handed back essentially to be grazing country again. The people who'd lived there were moved on, and the buildings were either removed or left to collapse. What's left is a fenced cemetery on someone else's land. And the quiet understanding among the people whose families are buried there, that visiting now means asking permission to step onto a property that used to be theirs. This one had a name that for a while appeared on official documents with something close to pride. It was conceived as a model, a place where, according to the policy language of the time, Aboriginal people would be brought to learn agriculture, trades, the habits of industry. A company town essentially, except the company was the government, and the product was meant to be assimilation. For a couple of decades it functioned. There was a sawmill, a dairy, dormitories, a church with a bell that could be heard for kilometres. Photographs from the period, official ones taken for government reports, show rows of workers, rows of buildings, an air of order and purpose. Then policy changed. The assimilation era thinking that had built the place fell out of favour, replaced by different approaches with different names. Funding was redirected. The town's purpose, such as it was, no longer existed. It was wound down gradually. A few families moved out each year, services reduced, until eventually there was no reason for anyone to stay. The sawmill is gone, the dairy is gone, the church is mostly gone, a few walls in the shape of where the bell tower stood. What remains is mostly described, in the rare instances it's described at all, as a former settlement, a phrase that manages to say almost nothing about the people who built it, lived in it, and were eventually told it no longer needed to exist. Here, the erasure isn't physical, not primarily, it's in the paperwork, or rather, in the paperwork that should exist and doesn't. A Lutheran mission operated for decades, baptizing children, recording births, keeping the kind of meticulous records that missions of that era were known for, ledgers, registers, names, dates, family connections, the sort of documentation that, for many Aboriginal families separated by later policies, would become the only way of ever reconstructing who belonged to whom. At some point, accounts vary on exactly when, and that vagueness is itself part of the story. Those records were transferred to state archives, and then they weren't there. Not destroyed in any documented fire, not lost in any recorded flood, just absent. Requests for them, made over the decades by descendants trying to trace family history, trying to find a grandmother's birth date or a great-uncle's baptism, come back empty. The mission existed. The buildings, what's left of them, still stand. But the names of the people who passed through it, the actual record of who they were, exist now mostly in family memory, fragile and increasingly second-hand. For families trying to reconnect with relatives separated during the Stolen Generations era, missing records aren't a bureaucratic inconvenience. They're a wall. Sometimes the only wall between someone and the answer to who they actually are. In one short period, an entire community was moved, not gradually, not over years, but in what survivors describe as a matter of days. Trucks arrived. People were told to gather what they could carry. Families who'd lived in the same place for generations, who had their own cemetery, their own gardens, their own networks of relationships with neighbouring communities, were loaded up and driven hundreds of kilometres to a reserve they'd never seen, with people they'd never lived alongside. The official reason, if there was ever one written down, hasn't surfaced. No government file has been located that explains the decision in the kind of detail you'd expect for something so disruptive. No health crisis cited, no land dispute, no infrastructure project requiring the site. What oral histories describe consistently across multiple families who were there is simply, men arrived, said it was happening, and it happened. The original site was left empty. Within a generation there was almost nothing to mark that it had been a community at all. Just clearings in the bush that, to an untrained eye, looked like they could be natural. The people who were moved, and their descendants, are still, to this day, in the place they were taken to. Some have tried to return, to visit, to simply see the place their grandparents talked about. Often, what they find is land now owned by someone else, fenced, with no acknowledgement that anything was ever there. There's a bend in a river, a flat stretch of cleared ground near it, that locals, the older ones anyway, refer to by a name that doesn't appear on any map and never did. It was here, according to accounts passed down through families in the region, that some of the earliest removals of children took place. Not a single event, a pattern, repeated over years, where government protectors or police would arrive, sometimes with little warning, and take children from their families. Some of those children were taken from this exact spot, loaded onto vehicles and driven away to institutions, never to return to the families they'd been born into. There's no memorial here, no sign, nothing that marks this ground as different from any other bend in any other river. For the families connected to this place, that absence is its own kind of statement. Sites of war are commemorated, sites of disaster get plaques. But a site where children were systematically separated from their parents, where that happened repeatedly as policy for years, has nothing. Just grass and a river, and the people who still know what it means getting older. Officially, for decades, this island was described in government documents using a particular phrase, a place of refuge, a mission of protection, language that suggested sanctuary, somewhere people were being looked after, kept safe. The reality, as recorded by the people who were sent there, and by the rare independent visitors who managed to get access, was closer to a prison. People were sent to the island not because they'd asked to go, but because they'd been deemed, in the language of the era, troublesome, or because they'd tried to leave other reserves, or simply because authorities decided they should be removed from wherever they'd been. There was no real way to leave. The island was surrounded by water that made unauthorized departure both dangerous and, in practical terms, almost impossible. Visits from family members on the mainland required permits that were often refused without explanation. The mission eventually closed, but the island didn't return to public use. It became, and largely remains, a restricted government area. Access today requires permission that's rarely granted, for reasons that are rarely explained, which means that even now the place where some of the most controlling chapters of this history played out is one that most Australians will never be able to see for themselves. A place of protection that nobody could leave, that almost nobody can visit. The language hasn't changed much. The function never really did either. This is the one that, when you first hear it, sounds like it has to be a misunderstanding. Surely a clerical error. Surely something that got corrected. It wasn't. A community in a remote part of the country was, at a certain point, formally recorded, and government reports, in census-adjacent documentation, as no longer existing. Extinct, in the language sometimes used at the time. The implication being that the people who'd once lived there had died out, or assimilated so completely into other populations that the community, as a distinct entity, no longer warranted recognition. Meanwhile, descendants of that community continued to live in the region. Some lived within a short drive of the site itself. They knew who they were. They knew their families' histories, their connections to that specific place. None of that had stopped being true, but on paper, in the documents that determine things like land rights, heritage recognition, eligibility for various forms of acknowledgement, the community had been declared not to exist. For the people affected, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It meant fighting, sometimes for decades, to have their own existence formally recognised by a system that had, at some point, simply written them out. There are places in this country where something happened, something violent, something final, and the only record of it exists in the way it's always existed, spoken, carried from person to person, told by elders to children who would one day be elders themselves, telling it again. No government inquiry, no coronial record, no newspaper report from the time that anyone has been able to locate. Just accounts, consistent, detailed, corroborated across multiple families with no apparent contact with each other, describing a massacre, a specific place, a specific period, people killed in numbers that vary slightly between tellings but that are never small. Researchers who've tried to investigate these accounts run into the same wall again and again. Without a written record, without an official acknowledgement, these events occupy a strange space. They're real. To the families who carry them, they're as real as anything in any history book. But officially they didn't happen. There's nothing to point to. No site has been formally recognised, no event formally named. Which means that somewhere in this country, right now, there's a patch of ground where something terrible happened, and the land itself carries no trace of it, and the only thing standing between that event and total silence is a shrinking number of people whose grandparents told them, and who are now the ones who have to decide who to tell next. One day, this was a community. Houses, a school, people going about ordinary lives. The next, or close enough to it, it was a military zone. There's no extended timeline here, no years-long process of decline. Accounts describe a sudden redesignation. The land, overnight in practical terms, reclassified for defence purposes, restricted, off-limits. Residents were given little choice, and, by most accounts, little time. Whatever couldn't be carried was left. The community dispersed, to other towns, to relatives elsewhere, to wherever people could go on short notice. What happened to the buildings afterward isn't well documented because the area itself became, by definition, not somewhere that gets documented. Restricted military land doesn't get visited by historians, doesn't get photographed for heritage surveys, doesn't appear in the kind of records that other abandoned places, even other erased communities, sometimes do. It's possible the buildings are still there, slowly falling apart behind a perimeter that keeps everyone out. It's possible they were demolished decades ago. Nobody outside whatever department oversees that land really knows. And the people who used to live there, who might have the most reason to want to know, have the least ability to find out. A community didn't decline here. It was switched off. For this last one, we don't have a name to give you. Not because we couldn't find it, but because, as far as anyone has been able to determine, it never had one. Not an official one. Not one that made it onto any survey, any government document, any map produced by any authority at any point. What it has, instead, is a location, known to a small and shrinking number of older Aboriginal people in the region, who can describe with precision where it is, what was there, and what happened to the people who lived there. They can describe the layout. They can describe specific families. Some can describe, in detail that researchers have found genuinely difficult to sit with, how the place came to be empty. But they can't point to a document. There's no deed, no mission record, no reserve gazette, nothing in any state archive that acknowledges this place ever had people living on it at all. Which means that when those last few people are gone, and for a place like this that's a matter of years now, not generations, there will be nothing left. Not a record to correct, not an omission to fix because there was never an entry in the first place. Just a patch of land, indistinguishable from the land around it that used to be somebody's home. We started this list with a building reduced to concrete slabs in the bush, something at least that could be found if you knew where to look. We end with a place that leaves behind nothing to find at all. That's the real shape of erasure. It's not always demolition. Sometimes it's just the slow withdrawal of acknowledgement. A name removed here, a record misplaced there, a community quietly reclassified until, one day, there's nothing left to point to. The map of Australia has these gaps in it. 13 of them at least. The ones we could trace enough to tell you about. There are almost certainly more. Places where the silence on the map isn't empty space at all. It's the last visible trace of something that was deliberately made to disappear.